Support for the CivicSciTV network comes from listeners and viewers like you, and organizations such as the Rita Allen Foundation, which invests in transformative ideas in their earliest stages to leverage their growth and promote breakthrough solutions to significant problems. Go to ritaallen.org to learn more.
Mapping the global landscape of civic science by dissecting new insights from researchers, practitioners, and leaders in academia, government, for-profit, and non-profit organizations. This is Questions of the Day with Fanuel Muindi.
Question: how do scientists and science engagers address the diversity of languages when it comes to science engagement and communication? Well, of course, English is a primary language of instruction and communication in science. But think of this: Africa alone has over 2,000 languages. What then? How do we facilitate science engagement in a way that people can understand, relate to, connect with, and contribute to in their language of choice? This is a topic we have briefly explored previously in talking with Paige Giroux and Rami Traurig about the usage of American Sign Language in science communication, and also with Rania Verk around what should be done given the lack of linguistic diversity in scientific publications. Well, in this special series on the Questions of the Day program, the founder of Under the Microscope and CivicSciTV's Africa Special Correspondent, Stephanie Okeyo, takes my seat and explores how different individuals and initiatives are using language to enhance science engagement in Africa. So you're in for a really nice treat. Stephanie takes a multifaceted approach to understanding this area by asking thought-provoking questions to various experts. These are scholars and practitioners working from different perspectives, including technology, education, research, edutainment, and linguistics. She had the opportunity to talk to various individuals representing 5 projects and initiatives that cover topics such as the role of policy in facilitating science education and communication in mother tongue languages, the cultural shift and Africans' attitudes towards their languages and views of Africa as a global scientific contributor, the exit and entry points of local languages in education, and so much more. Well, enough from me. As I said, you're in great hands in this special series. So here is Stephanie.
Hello, today we are joined by Mohamed Cissé and Grace Kago. Two wonderful researchers working in different areas. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. Kindly, Grace and Mohamed.
So my name is Grace. I am a life scientist who is interested in understanding the pathogenesis of bacteria that infect our gut. In addition to my life science research, I'm also interested in increasing access to science and science knowledge and science information across different language gaps. So during the COVID pandemic, one thing that I noticed was that there was a lot of scientific information that was being discovered in real time, but sometimes some of those details and some of that information was not being translated into different languages. And so as someone who was born on the African continent and who has family living on the African continent, I was really interested in thinking about ways to increase the access to some of this real-time knowledge and to translate. And so that is really what led me to kind of learn about the field of translation. And then the other thing that kind of challenged me to think about language translation was I myself realized I didn't really know my mother tongue that well. And so I decided to use this as a growth opportunity to develop my understanding of my mother tongue while also increasing basic science literacy. So I think that's like my short spiel.
So myself, my name is Mohamed Cissé. I'm a researcher in computer science and applied math. So I mostly do research in supply chain and logistics. So that's my journey as a scientist. And beside of that, I am very interested in African languages because I read numerous writers, Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Bakari Wanjo, and Francophone writers like Cher Anta Diop. And those people, yes, gave me a real sense about the issue related to the African languages. So some of the book, Colonizing the Mind, Alerte sous les tropiques. Sorry for this French book. But yeah, very interesting book about the African languages. And beside of that, I try as well to introduce some of the scientific concepts in my native languages. Susu, it is a dialect of Mandinka languages. And I'm trying as much as I can to just write computer software to help those languages in order to be more modern languages. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Mohamed and Grace. It's quite an interesting combination because Grace, you're from the life sciences research, and Mohamed, you're from the technology, if I could put it that way, computer science and mathematics and economics. And you wrote a paper together, which I came across, titled African Indigenous Languages in Science Engagement to Increase Science Trust. So what really initiated in terms of first having this discussion, and also why did you take an academic route to sharing this, and within that process what also have you learned?
So on my side, it exists a lot of books related to African languages. Okay, so the issue related to African languages, scientific book, and political book as well. So the first time I met Grace, it is very rare in our field, science, to see someone from African descent as well interested at the same time to the African languages. You see? So when I met Grace and I discovered that she has two qualities. First of all, she's like me. She was interested about African languages. And the second one, she's from Anglophone Africa. So she has another perspective of that issue related to the African languages. So this collaboration for me is always as well to bring, for me, a different experience in this science engagement. So Grace, go ahead if you want to add something else.
Yeah, so actually we met in a really interesting way because I actually reached out to the organization that Mohamed and one of his best friends have founded called the African Diaspora Scientists Federation. And their organization is really interested in increasing support and resources for African scientists. And so they are mostly focused in like academic empowering and doing like capacity building for academic researchers, because both of them are academic researchers. And so, or have their background in academic research. So I ran into this one paper that's written by Mohamed's colleague, where he makes an argument for using African languages to teach science. And so this is an interesting nuance because I have always been, my entry point was to do with like science engagement, but then Mohamed's colleague's entry point is he makes an argument for teaching science in mother tongues, and he uses his personal examples of like his family members. And I remember that this stood out to me because there is a lot of literature about modernizing African languages, but this was interesting because this was a very specific personal story. So I reached out to them and then just started having conversations with them. And at that time, Mohamed was building a story about increasing science trust by teaching in science languages, by teaching science in African languages. So we started having a conversation about that. And really that conversation is what you read in the paper. And then as to your question, why did we choose the academic route? I think we chose the academic route for two reasons. The first reason is because it was a really good exercise for us to think about our conversations and our thoughts in like a formal way. And I think a paper is a pretty good way to communicate that. Then the second reason is because we were interested in amplifying other people or amplifying this idea to other people who might be able to implement it. And those other people being hopefully government authorities or teachers and those sorts of people that I think are in the field. And so we figured a paper is a really great way to communicate that and to amplify it. And then I think I just remembered one last reason. Not too long before we wrote a paper, there are two scholars, one of whom is a professor of biomedical engineering, and then I think the other one is a scholar of marine science. And both of them had written a paper arguing for the increase in effectiveness of science engagement when you use multiple languages. So we were really inspired by their formal articulation of their ideals, and that is what challenged us to think about communicating our thoughts in a similar way.
Interesting inputs from both of you, and a few things arising. So first of all, from people who are diaspora, because you're currently, Mohamed, you before that you were outside Guinea, and Grace, right now you're Kenyan, but you're outside Kenya. Is it a different lens coming from or looking at it as somebody who's from diaspora or has been in diaspora than a scientist literally working within the African continent? Because it is interesting. It's a conversation. When we speak of language, it's about culture, and sometimes having that cultural or concept in conversations when you're outside the continent. I just interested to know your perspective on this.
I think that it is different to be a diaspora scientist and think about these topics, because I think on the continent, the scientists that are working scientists have a ton of other issues that they have to navigate. So I think in terms of time and in terms of access, as a diaspora scientist, you have a different vantage point because you're not in the system, you know? I also think that when you are a diasporian, you have the opportunity to think about different cultures. And I think you have a wider perspective on the issues that are present on our continent. And I think you can speak in a broader way. And I think that broadness sometimes lends you a different emphasis. And so I think specifically that's to say for many people on the continent, when they think about their mother tongues, they consider them and they relegate them to the spaces where they've always been. So for example, if you grow up in the city, odds are you only speak your mother tongue when you are in upcountry or when you're in the rural parts, right? But then when you leave your country of origin, then you start to see your mother tongue as belonging to the country versus just like your small pocket. And so then you start to think about like mother tongue more as a political tool rather than just a facet of your identity. So I think that those are some of the pieces that come together to make my perspective the way that it is. Because again, I think if I were on the continent, my concerns would be to do my science to the best of my ability because my resources and my time are very limited. Whereas when I'm a bit farther away, I'm able to get like a different nuance that I would not have on the continent, if that makes sense.
Yes. On my end, I think as a diasporan, I think first of all, the access to knowledge was more easier when I was living outside the continent, see? And that's led me to be interested on different texts related to African languages. When I was living in the continent, I did not find those texts in the continent, unfortunately. And thanks to this knowledge, I was more aware of the issues related to the African languages. And second, when I was talking with different people outside, for example, West African people, I discovered that, for example, I did not master my native language as they mastered the native language. For example, in Senegal, in the parliament, in different cases, they are very, very, very aware of the issue of African languages. So they perfectly master their native languages. So I just wanted to do exactly the same thing for my native languages. And the last one is outside the continent, you can really, really see that, for example, you have foreign languages in a country in which you live, for example, France or Canada, and which is used, for example, for science in political issues in different aspects of life. And when you are back to the continent, you see, for example, our languages are not poor. We just did not take the time and effort to bring all those concepts in our native languages. So that's why I put a lot of effort then to do exactly the same thing based on my abilities. Yeah.
One other thing that exists in the like world of talking mother tongues is that for many people that are on the continent, they were penalized for talking their mother tongue when they were young. And even to date, that still happens. So I think when you're outside of the continent, you're no longer in the same context where you have been punished for talking your mother tongue, right? Because I think even as recently as in October, there was 2 students who were talking in their mother tongue, I think at school. And I don't think that they were like gossiping or anything. I think they just started talking their mother tongue and they ended up being dismissed from school. So I think that type of culture makes it very hard for you to then now start thinking about expanding your mother tongue when like that is the same environment in which punitive actions have been taken against you. And I think that this phenomenon has been happening for a very, very long time. Like this is not just a recent thing. I think in one of Goge wa Thiong'o's books, he does describe this same thing happening in the 60s. So I think long story short is that the way that you use mother tongue is different depending on where you are. And you will be treated differently and it has different weight. So in some places, it becomes something that's representative of your culture. Then in some other places, it becomes something that needs to be pushed down and that something for which you will be penalized. So I think that type of context also shapes the extent to which you will be willing to develop your mother tongue, like while you're on the continent with your other pressing engagements.
Yes, exactly. For example, you don't have any advantages, for example, speaking your mother tongue, for example, to job application, to do science, to grow as for working in the government. So talking in our native languages do not give you any edge in the continent, unfortunately. So you have to live abroad and then more or less to change a bit your mind in order to see, okay, we have an issue here and we have to fight to change that issue in the continent. Yeah.
And it's interesting from what both of you are saying. It's with the journal you're talking about trust, and that's more of a cultural aspect. And with where you guys are rooting from, or why the interest even started, it shows first of all from African authors, and showing a political and also cultural. And speaking of colonization, so there is a whole trickle down effect. It's not something that happened just a century ago, but years beyond that. So a trickle down of aspect of colonization within this. But now on a research aspect, if you look at it, what is the research space when it comes to multilingual dissemination? As people who've been in the research space, what do you think is the state right now? And also, what is the entry point? What should be the entry point? Because Grace, it's interesting what you were saying. Should we start teaching science in the classroom rather than afterwards in the dissemination? So should it start from the education space rather first than in the communication space and engagement?
I think if I were to design a scenario, I think, well, let's start. The first question that comes to my mind is, what is the purpose of education? So I think if we start there, like, what is the goal of educating people? We want to educate people so that people can have a baseline understanding of certain facets and certain concepts in order to build a society that has certain foundations, right? And we want to make sure that whatever we're teaching is useful, it's relevant, and people can kind of build off of it in their experiential life, right? So at least that's like one of the ideas for why to educate people, is because you want to kind of bring people up to a very specific level of understanding in a very specific category of topics, right? So I think when you think about the function of religion, not religion, the function of education that way, then I think the concern becomes, what is the most effective way to equip a citizenry with the requisite skills to exist in our world? And so I think in that case, you can make an argument that education needs to be in a language that people can use to exist within the global context. Fine. So then the argument there ends with, it's not wise to teach using mother tongues because there's so many of them. And if our aim is just to make sure people exist with a certain basis of knowledge in order to engage with the world, then maybe that's not being achieved with multilingual education. In terms of engagement, I would say that engagement seems to me to be a better entry point because there are many different ways to teach in an informal space that can leverage understanding in culture, if that makes sense. And it also requires the input of multiple people. And then that way, like, I think it becomes part of the culture instead of just relegated to school. So the way I imagine it is, right now, when you think of science education, there is a lot of science education happening on the African continent, right? But a lot of the ideas of the classroom, the ideas within the classroom, they don't necessarily make it outside of the classroom into the culture. So another thing that the audience may not know is that I am part of a nonprofit based in Kenya that is run by Stephanie, actually, called Under the Microscope. And within this environment, we think a lot about science literacy. And what we have learned is that when you look at lay audiences, i.e. people who are not working within science environments, there are some access and knowledge gaps. So for many people who are adults, are we going to expect them to go back to school in order to learn about science and learn about science in their mother tongues? That's not likely. But in many instances, if we focus on science engagement, then we can equip people with the language with which they can then kind of disperse it within their communities and within their ways of understanding. So I think what I'm saying is that if I were to pick between science engagement versus teaching science in the classroom, for me, it seems more feasible to do science engagement and to kind of spend more time doing science engagement in mother tongues than it does to kind of overhaul the education system, is my sense.
Yes, I agree as well, because I think nowadays we have a lot of media, for example, social networks, we have as well TV, radio, so we can really disseminate all this culture thanks to those media. And I think on the school right now, based on my knowledge, we don't have a lot of books, scientific books in our native languages, but it exists as right now, some of the concept already translated in our native languages. So for example, using those media, it's more easy to broad science in the population. And something is important for me in science engagement. Our people will no more think that, for example, science is for foreign people, for white people, is a white thing, you see? And in most cases, for example, for example, in Cameroon, we have that expression in France, la chose du blanc, the white thing. So, for example, everything related to science for us is the white thing. So, I think the best thing to do with science engagement is to break that idea in order to broad as much as possible the science in the population. Yeah.
Mohamed, I think that is also interesting when you're saying it has been categorized particularly as a white thing. The use of native language also gives it a little bit of ownership and an entry point also to show diversity and inclusion. So it's an interesting point where you're saying the role of language also brings in diversity and inclusion.
Stephanie used the right word, ownership. We have to honor more the science thing, you see? For example, people really think that as science was born outside the continent, they really think that science was born outside the continent. But even if you see inside the continent, we say, for example, something like black magic. If you dig a bit into it, you can discover that, for example, they use scientific concept in some sense as well, you see? And as we don't really take the time to study what African people are doing, we think that, for example, it is foreign thing or it's a magic, but we can, with simple scientific concept, explain a lot of ideas around us. For example, in biology, we can explain easily what is a cell. We can explain easily what is a reproduction, and thanks to that, we can really broad science in the population. Yeah.
Oh, I think my point was also to bring up to remind myself and the audience that the reality is that this conversation has been happening for a very long time. So this is not like something that is brand new. I think if they take some time to look at some of the references that we have chosen in our paper, but even like if you spend some time diving into the literature of scholars who think about multilingual education, you will find that this discussion with relation to the African continent has been going on forever. Yet, when you look at the status of things, we haven't made so much progress, because I think what ends up happening is people kind of get caught up in the fact that there are so many African languages. And at the end of the day, again, when you think about what is the purpose of education, if you want people to exist within this global context, then the argument is made that you want people to master a language that is relevant for more people in different parts of the world, right? So I think the topic of education, from what I can tell, is a situation that people have been going back and forth with for a very long time. So when I think of a potential like next step, I'm thinking in terms of what can we try that can actually help to move this needle forward. And so that's why I think I put my stakes in science engagement, because I realize that there are many people that can do this type of work, because there's many people who are educated in basic biology concepts. There are also many people that speak their mother tongues. And so I think that, in my mind, is an area where I think we can make more progress within a certain unit time versus trying to change these institutions of learning, which are built on very specific principles and which have been kind of going around in circles for a long time. Then the second thing I think to do with science, with multilingualism in general, is there has been a lot of research by people who research people who are bilingual and trilingual and multilingual in general. And they have shown that actually being multilingual is related to being able to like solve problems faster and to like it actually helps to expand your brain in a really unique and interesting way. So there are specific benefits to being multilingual. I think just people get caught up in which are useful languages to learn, and many parents are usually thinking, how can I make sure my kid has a competitive edge? And so then they end up wanting their kids to speak languages that will help them to compete on the global scale. But they forget that you also need to make sure people have their understanding of themselves. And I think that's where mother tongue education importance comes in, I think.
Just you both of you have brought in Mohamed, the concept of translation, and Grace, the aspect of having so many languages. South Africa has over 2,000 languages. So Grace, as someone who Grace also hasn't mentioned, she does have a channel in which she teaches molecular or cell biology in her mother tongue, Gikuyu. Mohamed, also as someone who's from computer science, what do you think is the role of technology in this? So Grace, from you, like as a basic translator, what is the journey there? And also Mohamed, as somebody from within the innovation space per se, or technology, what do you think the role of technology is in terms of facilitating multilingual communication?
Part of the journey that I have decided to take is to do translation in my mother tongue, translation of a subject that I know in my mother tongue. And that's for two reasons. Number one is to encourage other people to kind of go on similar journeys. I don't know that I've been so successful, but I think that's what I would like to do. Then the second also is for myself. I want to be more fluent and have more understanding of my mother tongue. And so this has been a way that I've been able to challenge myself and to grow in this area. So I think it's multifaceted in that way. And the journey has been interesting and fascinating, and I'm really grateful for the experiences that I've had so far.
So on my end, as a tech guy, I mostly try to implement a lot of software related to African languages. So for example, in some cases, for example, to translation, automatic translation, I don't know if you already heard about ChatGPT. So we can do some of the translation using that type of tool. You can as well generate automatic dictionaries as well. And for example, with the natural language processing, it's a field in computer science. We use it, for example, to just understand the grammar of languages. So the tech can really speed the creation of the generation of books, of grammar books, this kind of stuff. But I think if we use it carefully, the technology, we can really speed, we can really reduce the time needed to create different tools in our languages as well. And for example, we can as well decrease the learning curve, you see. But unfortunately, we can have, for example, website, we can mobile app to ease the learning curve in our native languages. Yeah.
And my last question, as people who are bringing forward or highlighting this topic, you did mention, even in your paper, there are several people who are already within the science engagement. So, and also researchers and scholars who are doing this work. What will be your advice for people who are trying to bridge the gap of knowledge access, knowledge dissemination, knowledge production, with the concept of use of different languages to make it more inclusive and diverse? So it could be any group in which you think will be relevant. Could be an engager, could be a researcher, scientist, as yourselves. what would you, if somebody asked you, what would be your tip for or advice for somebody who is trying to look at language as an aspect of inclusion in the science engagement world?
I think what I would say is, right now, from what I have learned about this space, there's not a lot of people doing this. And so to not be discouraged if you get some pushback or if people are not super excited about it at first, just because there's not that many folks that are doing it, especially in African languages. I think that if you choose to take this road, I think you have to make sure that it also is like a very personal development process as well. Because I think if you're looking for external accolades, that will be a bit challenging, just because there's not that, because it takes some time, I think, to build some of these ideas and concepts. So I think I would encourage people to really think about it in terms of a personal introspective journey, and not just a journey where they will expect all these accolades and like metrics of success to kind of follow them along.
So on my side, I have two tips. The first one is to do a review of literature. So when I started, I discovered that it exists in the past a lot of writers who were interested in these topics. So you cannot think that, for example, you are alone. It exists a lot of people. Maybe they stop it, but they already wrote a lot of things about that. So you have to take your time, 1 year, maybe 2, just to read the books, the papers they wrote before even you started. And the second thing is to keep in mind that, for example, you will not have gains in the short term. You will see those gains in the very long term, you see? And even if you don't have those gains in short term, it's not a big deal. Just be patient enough in order to you have to see that mission as a transfer between generations. See, it is a long fight, and you have to be very patient and resilient in order to bring that issue, that problem in the forefront.
Thank you so much, Mohamed and Grace. I will also put in, share the paper. It's open access for anyone also who's interested. And I think these are topics as we go along, as you said, that people who've already worked on it. It's a build up and it's transfer, pass of battalion of the work. So I really thank you and for taking the time.